Next, we'll talk about using a point-and-shoot camera for food photography. This is what I used for over 6 months, and it certainly has a place in the world of food photography. So we'll talk about the advantages of using a point-and-shoot camera, the disadvantages of using a point-and-shoot camera, how to get the most out of your camera, and when it's best to use this camera as opposed to the other options. The advantages of a point-and-shoot camera are first that they're very portable and convenient. They're not quite as small as a phone, but they're fairly easy to slip in your pocket and pull out whenever you need them. If you want to take one to a restaurant, for example, it's a little less conspicuous than lugging a big DSLR around your neck. They're also much more affordable than a DSLR. Entry-level point-and-shoot cameras will be maybe $80 to $100. You can go up to $300 or $400 for much more expensive ones, but they're certainly cheaper than DSLRs. They're also very easy to use, as it's implied in their name. You just point and you shoot. You don't have to know about the settings, you don't need to know about the settings, and you can't even change the settings if you wanted to, so they're much easier to use in a general sense. They do have better sensors and lenses than mobile cameras. They're a little bigger lenses, bigger sensors, and these result in crisper images. And they do offer you a little bit of control over the exposure settings, usually not a lot, but sometimes you can change the exposure compensation or the shutter speed if it's a more high quality point-and-shoot camera. But there are a number of disadvantages for point-and-shoots. They have limited control over the exposure settings, like the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. It gives you very little control over the depth of field as well. There's also no white balance control on the final images. And we'll talk about raw formats in a minute, but you can't really control the white balance after the picture has been taken. In post-production, you're pretty much stuck with what you got, and if you get your white balance wrong, that can be a big problem. There's no interchangeable lenses, so you're stuck with a lens that's right on the camera. The image quality, while better than mobile cameras, is definitely not on the DSLR level for most situations. And typically, the images will require a lot more editing and processing than the DSLR image will. And I found this to be a huge issue for me once I switched to DSLR. So I would spend maybe an hour to sometimes even 2 hours editing my pictures from my point-and-shoot camera because they needed a lot more compensation. I had to blur the background myself. I had to undistort certain aspects of the images from the lower quality lenses. They needed to be brightened. I had to adjust the contrast. I had to adjust the colors. And all of that work went into making these pictures look more realistic. Whereas a DSLR image, it's almost completely done the minute I upload it to my computer. So I save, probably an hour or two on every photo shoot that I use a DSLR for, just because being a perfectionist, I don't have to do so much to make the images look perfect on a DSLR, whereas a point-and-shoot camera, there's a lot of distortions and things that need to be corrected. So that's a really big disadvantage for me, and I'm sure it could be for you as well. So given that we've looked at the advantages and the disadvantages, when would it be more appropriate to use a point-and-shoot camera as opposed to the other options? The biggest reason is when you need a higher quality camera than a mobile phone, but you don't quite have the budget for a more expensive DSLR. And this is where I was when I started out. As I've said, I used a point-and-shoot for a while, and I didn't have the budget for a DSLR, but I knew that my iPhone would never cut it to take really more professional quality pictures for my website. So I got a point-and-shoot, and it worked really well for me. Another reason is if you just don't want to learn the more complex settings of a DSLR, or you don't have the time or the interest, then a point-and-shoot camera makes it a lot easier because there's less complexity. Another interesting reason to use a point-and-shoot camera is maybe you have a higher quality camera, but you want something more portable, and for whatever reason, maybe you don't have a smartphone or your smartphone camera isn't going to cut it. So it's something more portable than a DSLR camera, but you don't have a mobile phone that could take its place. So if you do choose to use a point-and-shoot camera, what can you do to get the most of it? The first, as always, is to make sure your scene has good lighting. A point-and-shoot camera doesn't have as big of a lens or as big of a sensor as a DSLR, which means it's just not going to let as much light into the scene, and it's going to have to compensate by bumping up the ISO and adding more noise to the pictures, which makes them look worse. The way around this, just like with the iPhone, is to make sure your scene has plenty of natural, bright light that makes your scenes look great. You also want to understand your camera's specific potential, because not every point-and-shoot camera is equal. I mean, there's literally hundreds of models to choose from, and each of them offer different controls. There's even a few that shoot in RAW format, as we'll talk about later. So understanding how your camera works and what specific advantages it offers you is very important. I think the balance of the photographer and the camera working together is really key to getting the best shots. It doesn't matter so much how high quality the camera is, but it matters that you understand how to use your specific model. And as I mentioned, you're going to have to do more editing with these type of pictures. And we'll talk about editing later, but if you're going to be using a point-and-shoot camera, it's good to have something like Photoshop where you can do more effects and undistort the images and bump up the colors and the contrast and the brightness, which is almost certainly going to be needed on these type of images. So if you do that, you can make them look a lot better and really get the most out of your camera. It can seem like a point-and-shoot camera is really the worst of both worlds. It's stuck between not being as portable as a mobile phone, but not being as high quality as a DSLR. And it is true that their sales are going down, and mobile phones are cannibalizing the popularity of point-and-shoot cameras. But there's really good reasons to use this camera if it suits your needs, as we've talked about. If you don't have the budget for a DSLR and maybe you don't want to use your phone, it really does make a nice middle ground. And I've taken dozens or hundreds of really good pictures that have been really successful for my website on my point-and-shoot camera, and I still have a really strong affinity for it. I even use it every once in a while. It does work well in some situations, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with using a point-and-shoot camera if it meets your needs. If you aren't going to be using a point-and-shoot camera, there's really nothing you need to do in this lesson, but if you are, make sure you can get comfortable with your camera. Read the manual, understand how all the features work now that you understand the ISO and shutter speed and aperture, and see how much of this you can control and what you can do to maximize its effectiveness. And spend some time setting up a scene, doing a food photo shoot using all the techniques we've learned in this course, and try to get the most out of your specific camera. Because again, it's really about that balance between camera and photographer. So learn how to use your camera, become really comfortable with it, and it'll help your pictures look a lot better.